Hey, you remember back in Matthew 22 when Jesus said, Many are called, but few are chosen? Today in Matthew 25, we're going to find out what that means. Are you among Jesus's chosen people? Let's dive in. So we begin Matthew 25 with a parable that's very similar to the parable that he was telling at the end of Matthew 24. It's not quite a parable, but it's very similar to that. The whole point of how he wrapped up the previous chapter was to tell them to live in readiness, to always be ready for the return of the Son of Man, the parousia, because it was going to happen at a time that they did not know and they could not expect. It was going to be like the days of Noah. He starts chapter 25 with essentially the same parable that he ended on. The kingdom of heaven will be compared to 10 virgins who took their lamps out to meet the bridegroom. Now, this is your first daily Bible insight for the day. This whole idea of the bridegroom is becoming very prevalent throughout the gospel. I alluded to it in the introduction, talking about the parable of the wedding feast back in Matthew 22, where the statement is made, the many are called, but the few are chosen, because a man who's invited into the feast doesn't put on the feasting garment that he's been given. But what we're seeing here is this idea of the bridegroom comes up. And this is a callback to something that happens in the 45th Psalm, where God is described like a bridegroom adorned for his bride and ready to go to war and to strike down unrighteousness. So here you have Jesus depicted as a bridegroom, something that Paul is going to allude to in Ephesians chapter 5 when he talks about the roles of husbands and wives, and a husband is to love his wife as Christ loves the church, a theme that'll get picked up again in the book of Revelation. Over and over and over again, you have this idea of those who are the chosen, the called out, those who are part of the church are, as a whole, the bride of Christ. So 5 of them were foolish and 5 of them were prudent. Now remember, we're asking the question, are we ready to meet Jesus? Are we among the chosen? Well, here's the first lesson. Wise and foolish, this is your second insight, should point us back to the Proverbs. So we're looking for wisdom. We've got a contrast here. We should be looking for wisdom, and it's really right there on the nose of it, right? 5 of them are wise and 5 of them are foolish. Look at what distinguishes the wise and the foolish. The wise took extra oil, the foolish took only enough oil. And it says, while the bridegroom was delaying, they all became drowsy and began to sleep. But at midnight, there was a shout, behold, the bridegroom, come out to meet him. I want you to understand what just happened. The bridegroom came at an hour that they did not expect. That is a direct callback to the previous chapter. I want you to see the distinction here. 5 of them brought extra. They expected that the bridegroom might be delayed. This may be a longer wait than we anticipated. The wait may be more difficult. 5 of them were only sort of halfway committed. They only really brought enough for exactly what was expected, that they didn't anticipate that this might be more difficult than what they initially thought. Now let's see where this goes. It says, then all the virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the prudent, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. So they're not prepared because he came at an hour when they didn't expect. Of course, they're told no, that there's only enough for the need of the wise. And so they needed to go and try to make ready in haste. Well, what did Jesus say in the previous chapter about the coming of the Son of Man and how it was going to be different from the end of the age that would mark the destruction of the temple? They weren't going to be able to say, look, the Son of Man's in an inner room where he's out in the wilderness. He says that's not what the coming of the Son of Man is going to be like. He's not going to come in secret. For just as the lightning comes from the east and the flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be, back in 24 and 27. So that there's not going to be time to prepare at that moment. The Apostle Paul describes the return of Jesus and our translation from mortal to immortal as happening in the moment, in a twinkling of an eye. So there is no time to prepare. And while they were going away to make the purchase, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding feast. Again, call back to Matthew 22, call back to the 45th Psalm, and the door was shut. Later, the other virgins also came saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. I'm not going to make this point 3. I'm going to call this 2a, but that should take us back to Matthew 7. Lord, Lord. They're acknowledging Jesus as the Lord. They're acknowledging him as the Messiah, but they weren't prepared to receive him. And so he answered, truly, I say to you, I do not know you. So to be now, that is the same dismissal that we see back in Matthew 7. I don't know you. So be on the alert then, for you do not know the day or the hour, just in case we missed it the first time around, right? Next, we have the parable of the talents. And out of the three parables in this section, there's some debate over whether or not the judgment scene is a parable, but this is probably the most well-known of the three. So you remember this story, right? You have a king, you have a man who's wealthy, and he's about to go on a journey. He calls his slaves to him, and these would be stewards, very trustworthy men, and he gave them his possessions. And the expectation was that they were supposed to give him the increase. We're going to talk about what this looks like and what the connection is to Matthew 23 and 24 when we get to the end of this parable. But for right now, I want you to soak this in, think about that message, see if you can figure it out before we get there, and leave it in the comments. But it says, to one he gave 5, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. Again, remember, this is coming right out of Matthew 23. There's no break between 22, 23, and 24. This is all the same conversation happening. So the one who received the 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner, the one who received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who had received the 1 talent, okay, so here's where we're diverging from the expected. Here's the divergent. The one who received the 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. So again, you've got a contrast here. You've got some wisdom, some James, some Proverbs-like thinking here. There's a clear delineation between 2 lines of thoughts. Now look at what it says. Now, after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who received 5 talents, you remember how this goes, he received 5 more. He says, Master, you entrusted me with 5 talents. See, I've given you 5 more. His master said, well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord, or the joy of your master. The 2-talent man hears the same thing. He went and did the same thing. He hears the same thing. That idea, enter into the joy of your Lord. I want you to think about that, because that's one of the big points of differences. In fact, I'm calling this point number 3 in our daily Bible insight. That idea of the 2-talent and 5-talent man, they understood what it meant to acknowledge the master as Lord. Now we're introduced to the 1-talent man. This is where the divergence comes in. Now, if you know how this relates to the last 4 chapters of the book of Matthew, leave it in the comments. But here's the hint. Here's where it comes in. Beginning in verse 24, and the one also who had received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you scattered no seed. So first of all, he sounds like he's blaming the master here for his failure. But in some ways, he's kind of expressing a praise to him. It's not what the master wants, but he's saying, look, you're shrewd. You're powerful. Here's the conclusion he came to. And I was afraid and went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. I've always thought it was interesting. This is not one of the insights, but you can call it 3A if you want to, that he says, I was afraid. You know the first time somebody says, I was afraid in the Bible? Genesis chapter 3. What was the occasion? What was going on? God had come to the garden after they ate the fruit from the tree, right? Adam's response when God asked where he was, I was afraid. I don't know that that is deliberate, but I also don't know that it isn't, because it's really the same set of circumstances, isn't it? But his master answered and said to him, you wicked and lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I did not sow, gathered where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. One of the big mistakes that I think we make about this parable is we make it about the talents. And sometimes that even translates into our talents. You'll hear somebody say, I need to use my talents to serve God. That's not what this parable is about. The master had an expectation. He knew exactly what he had given them. He knew exactly what he wanted done with it. The point of this parable is a direct contrast with the Pharisees, who didn't really respect God. They loved the greetings in the market. They loved the best places at the feast. They loved to be called father and rabbi by men. They loved those things. That's what their devotion was to. The devotion of the one talent man, the master said, was to wickedness and laziness. It wasn't to the kind of work that he should have been doing. This is an indictment to the spiritual leaders of Israel. The idea of the talent there is something that we totally miss, that it's not just a few coins as is sometimes depicted in images. It's more like 75 to 100 pounds of a precious metal. So this man had 100 pounds of gold, let's say, and he went and dug a hole and he hid it because he was lazy and he was wicked. He says it's because he's afraid. He says he's God-fearing, but really what he's doing is he's being wicked and lazy. Think back, and I'm going to call this point number 4. Think back to how the Pharisees were teaching the law in Matthew 5. Think back to their devotion in Matthew 6, in giving alms, in praying prayers, in their fasting. None of that was for love of God. They were teaching people shortcuts rather than teaching them the law. And instead, what they were doing was they were gaining for themselves as they ignored the fact that they were seated in Moses' seat. Forget the fact, and I'm going to do a whole video and probably next week on who the Pharisees were that's outside of our Daily Bible Insight. Hope you'll check that out. Subscribe if you'd like to know more about that. And I hope you're journaling these, because what you're seeing is Jesus is laying bare the thinking of the Pharisees. They thought that God wasn't going to return, and when the Messiah came, they would be rewarded for their shrewdness. And what Jesus says is they should have been focused on the increase. How does that apply to us at the end of time? Same principle, right? Jesus has communicated what his kingdom looks like. He's been calling it the gospel of the kingdom. We've been calling it the doctrine of the kingdom. Remember, the great will be least and the least will be great. He expects them to serve one another. Think about all the things he'll say when we get over into the Gospel of John about loving one another as I have loved you. That's his expectation. We can invest ourselves in doing that, and we can grow, and we can draw others to him, or we can hide that in the ground, not letting our light shine before men, going back to Matthew 5 and the Sermon on the Mount. I'm going to call that one 4A. That's not your 5th. And we'll be condemned for it. So what are we doing with the time that we have? Are we using it in the way Jesus expects? In case we don't understand that, there's one more parable. It says in verse 31, but when the Son of Man comes in his glory, when the parousia happens, that's what he's got them looking forward to. Not a rapture, not a new Jerusalem. The next thing he wants them watching for is the return of the Son of Man. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him. He will separate them from one another. I want you to notice what he's separating. All the nations are gathered before him. Rapture holds that the ones that are part of the true church get raptured away in a secret rapture, either pre or post-tribulation. I want you to see what he just says. He gathers all the nations before him, and he will separate them from one another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on the right hand and the goats on the left. He's separating his people, his chosen ones, his sheep from the nation. Now, I want you to look in this particular parable about what divides the sheep from the goats. What's the difference between the called and the chosen? First thing we saw, they're looking for the day of the Lord. Second thing we saw, they're living up to the expectations of the Lord. Third thing, the king will say to those on his right hand, come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in, naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Then the righteous have not been raptured away. The righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? And the king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. So here's your fifth point right here. Are you ready? Do you see what separates the sheep from the goats? It's servanthood, isn't it? What have we been saying all along is the doctrine of the kingdom. The least will be the greatest, and the greatest will be the least. And if you don't understand this, you're going to be cast into outer darkness. I want you to look at what happens. I'm gonna put a 5a here and talk about Jesus being the king, but I want you to see what happens next. Then he will say to those on his left, and it's the same speech, only it starts with, depart from me, accursed ones. Here's your 5b. This goes back to Matthew 23. What did I tell you the word woe meant back in Matthew 23? That's right. It meant cursed. I hope you got the journaling Bibles and you're making these connections. This is huge. It will change the way you read the book of Matthew. So depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. Hell is prepared for devil and his angels. Jesus is talking about hell here. I want you to see what he just did. Think about the woes of Matthew 23. Here's why. I was hungry and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger. You did not invite me in. And the list goes on and on and on. And they say, Lord, when did we see you? And they list out those things. And he says, to the extent that you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. That's what it means to be among the chosen. Had you humbled yourself to be serving others, it's not a checklist of, oh, yeah, we visited people. Yes, we gave to people. Yes, we provided for people. Did you have the humility to bend yourself that low? That's what it means to be the chosen of Jesus. Many are called, but few are chosen. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. Matthew 25 is much deeper than we give it credit for, but you really need to see the contrast between the Pharisees there. I really want you to check out this video right over here on the rapture. It's actually the first of two because we talked about that yesterday in Matthew 24. And until I see you Monday to talk about Matthew 26, have a good day and God bless.